I'm delighted to welcome you to the Royal Asiatic Society, old and new friends. I'm Susan Whitfield. I'm a member of Council of the Society, and I'm here to introduce the lecture tonight. But before I introduce the lecture, I just want to say, for any of you who are new to the Royal Asiatic Society, we run lots of events like this. We're very sociable. We have a very good calendar of events, and we're a charity, we rely on membership to be able to put on events like this. So any of you consider joining, please do. That would be very welcome. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Alexandra Buhler, who's going to speak tonight about her recent book, and there's copies over there, Zoroastrianism in India and Iran. Alexandra trained at Oxford and then did her MA and PhD at SOAS and now works in King's College Library. And her book came out last year and we're very excited to hear your lectures. So, and we're hoping there's not some event other than the lecture. So she's come out
Me
today.
too.
Yes. But so thank you very much. And afterwards, I should say to our online speakers, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. For the rest of you, we'll take questions afterwards. I would just ask you, before you ask the questions, allow me to come and give you the mic so that the people online can hear the questions as well. Okay, so without any further ado, thank you very much, and please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan, for such a warm introduction. And thank you, everyone at the Royal Asiatic Society, Alison, Yuri, who are online, Matti, everyone who helped organise this. And thank you all for being here in person and online. I will sit down now, but so yes, so today I'll be talking on one aspect of my recent book, which is about relations between Zoroastrians in India and Iran during the late 19th and early 20th century. So the late Qajar period and the early Pahlavi period. And today I'll be focusing in particular on the role played by the British in encouraging strong relations between the two Zoroastrian communities during the late Qajar period, and on the geopolitical interests and factors that motivated them to support Zoroastrians in Iran. So I'll just begin by briefly outlining the history of Zoroastrians in India and Iran and the relations between the two communities. So Zoroastrianism was the dominant religion in Iran before the Arab Muslim conquest of the mid-7th century. Due to long-standing trade relations between Iran and India, there were already Zoroastrians living in India before the establishment of Muslim rule. But in the centuries following the establishment of Muslim rule in Iran, the number of Zoroastrians who settled in India increased. And this was for a range of reasons, economic as well as due to persecution and Zoroastrians wanting to leave Iran. And the community in India became known as the Parsis, which comes from the term Pars or Fars, the region of Iran. And over the centuries, there were relations between the two communities. For example, letters were sent between the 15th and the 18th century from Parsis to Zoroastrians in Iran, particularly asking about questions of religious practice. And then by the 19th century, we see that the position of the two communities was very different. In India, with increased numbers of European merchants arriving on the western coast of India from the 17th century, Parsis, who had mainly been agriculturalists to this point, began to do well as brokers and agents. Parsis were also very quick to settle in Bombay, now Mumbai, when the British were developing the area. And mutually beneficial relations with the British helped Parsis prosper as merchants. And due to the high level of education in the community, they were also very influential in legal and political spheres. Whereas in Iran, the situation was very different. Over time, Islam became the most widely practiced religion, and Zoroastrians faced discrimination due to their position as non-Muslims. This did fluctuate, but seems to have worsened towards the end of the Safavid period, so the late 17th century. And by the early Qajar period, so the late 18th, early 19th century, the majority of Zoroastrians were struggling economically. And this was particularly because of a tax that was levied on non-Muslims, the jizya. And they were also facing discrimination. So because of the difficult situation in Iran at this time, some Zoroastrians were emigrating to India, and the Parsis learned even more about the conditions in Iran. And in 1853, that one. 1853, Iranian Zoroastrians in India, together with some Parsis and the children of marriages between the two groups, they formed the Society for the Amelioration of the Conditions of the Zoroastrians in Persia, which is quite a mouthful, so I'll refer to it as the Amelioration Society from now on. And this philanthropic organization, the following year, in 1854, they sent an emissary, Manikji Limji Hataria, to Iran to manage their operations. So as well as setting up schools, and here we can see Zoroastrian schoolboys in Tehran, so he established a boarding school in Tehran, as well as setting up schools, repairing and rebuilding religious buildings like fire temples, encouraging religious reforms along the lines of Parsi practice. Hataria also campaigned for the jizya to be cancelled, the tax. And after decades of campaigning, it was finally cancelled in 1882. And this was significant because the economic burden of the jizya was incentivizing conversion to Islam, which was a particular concern as the Zoroastrian population was believed to be very low. And there was one estimate that maybe there were only about 8,000 individuals. So the Parsis were very worried about the number of Zoroastrians left in Iran. So from the mid-19th century, we do see the strengthening of relations between Zoroastrians in India and Iran, which had a positive impact on Zoroastrians in Iran. And Parsis drew on their good relations with the British and used their position as British subjects to get British support for the work of the Amelioration Society. So Hataria moved to Tehran in 1856 to be nearer the center of power and to be better positioned to campaign against the jizya. And in 1860, he met with the then Shah, Nasr al-Din Shah, and that portrait, I think, is just from the year before, so he probably looked similar to how he does in the portrait. He met with the Shah, and this meeting was actually facilitated by the British minister in Iran at the time, Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was very interested in ancient Iran and did a lot of research into cuneiform inscriptions. And you can see in this portrait, there are actually some papers of his, and his archives are here. All his archives are held at the Royal Asiatic Society, which I haven't looked at, but I'd be very interested to see another time. And he was the president of the RAS as well. So a nice connection to where we are tonight. So Rawlinson helped organize this meeting between Hataria and the Shah. And on this occasion, Hataria was able to negotiate a decrease in the sum demanded from Zoroastrians each year. And he also organized for it to be paid directly to the central Iranian authorities by the Amelioration Society via the British legation. So it meant that in sort of regional areas, Zoroastrians couldn't be made paid more than they were meant to be paying. And the British also helped Parsis gain access to the Shah when he visited Europe. There was a small but influential Parsi community in Britain, which was in communication with Hataria and the Amelioration Society. And when Nasr al-Din Shah visited Europe for the first time in 1873, here he is at what is now the Royal Opera House, then the Royal Italian Opera. It was first time in Europe. He did a tour around, came to London. And in London, he met with a group of 4 Parsis, one of whom was Dadabhai Naroji, who was in 1892 became the first Asian member of parliament. So in 1873, during the Shah's visit, Naroji and the other 3 Parsis in the group presented the Shah with a petition signed by 1,500 individuals, which asked for the end of discriminatory practices. Again, Rawlinson appears. He helped plan this meeting together with Edward Eastwick, an Orientalist and diplomat who had also worked in Iran in the early 1860s. And this pattern continues. In 1881, another petition was presented to the Shah, this time in Iran. And this was from Zoroastrians in India, but was given to the Shah by the British representative in Tehran, Ronald Ferguson Thompson. And the Amelioration Society was assured by the Shah, by the government of India, that positive changes would be implemented. And sure enough, a few months later, the jizya was abolished for Zoroastrians. So Parsis had effectively made use of their political influence and their relations with the British to achieve this goal. And over the following years, Parsis continued to put pressure on Nasr al-Din Shah and on his son and successor, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, to improve the position of Zoroastrians in Iran. So again, in 1889, this is the Shah arrives in London on a rather fancy steamboat coming up the Thames. And on this occasion, Nauroji again presents the Shah with an address. And this address had been written with the help of Edward Brown, who was a young scholar at the time, who'd just recently come back from a trip to Iran, where he went in 1887 to 88. And he'd shown a particular interest in the Zoroastrian community while he was there. And Brown's work was also published in the Journal of the RAS. So another link. I found quite a few links to the RAS, which was very satisfying. So in reference to this 1889 petition, Colonel Ross, who was the British resident in Bushehr in southern Iran, believed that on his return to Iran, the Shah would be, I quote, particularly well disposed to attend to any representations which may be considered advisable to make on behalf of the Zoroastrians. So we can see these links, and the British clearly playing a supportive role for the work of the Amelioration Society. So positive relations between the British and the Parsis meant that the British were intervening to help Zoroastrians in Iran, for example, the campaign to end the jizya. But in addition to maybe some pressure from Parsis and possible humanitarian concerns, the British also had other reasons for wanting to assist Zoroastrians in Iran. The British believed that they would benefit if Iranian Zoroastrians were in a better economic and political position, and they hoped that stronger links between Iranian Zoroastrians and Parsis might encourage Zoroastrians in Iran to feel loyalty towards them, mirroring widespread loyalty to the British amongst Parsis. And it's important to bear in mind the Russians had benefited from ties with the Armenian community in northern Iran, particularly in relation to trade. And the British were keen to use their relations with Zoroastrians in a similar way, believing it might help them increase their political reach and their influence in Iran. So this was a time when the British were concerned about a possible Russian advance towards India, which was under British colonial rule. And the rivalry between Britain and Russia in Iran and Central Asia, particularly Afghanistan, during this period is sometimes known as the Great Game. So the British were worried about expansionist Russia. Russia in the early 19th century had fought a couple of wars with Iran, which had resulted in Iranian territorial losses. In the mid-19th century, the British resisted Iranian efforts to secure control over Western Afghanistan, and they were concerned that there was too much Russian influence in the Qajar court. So this resulted in the Anglo-Persian War of 1856-7. But although there were instances of military force being used, by the end of the 19th century, Anglo-Russian rivalry was increasingly played out in the economic sphere, with both powers competing over trade and concessions. So the British were focusing their efforts on the southern provinces of Iran. So in the beginning of the 19th century, that's where Iran lost some territory. And the British were worried about this sort of area here that the Russians might come down towards India. Worth bearing in mind that Zoroastrians were mainly living in Yazd and Kerman, these areas, those central southern Iran. By this time, so by the late 19th century, a number of Zoroastrians had emerged as successful merchants and wealthy landowners. So here we've got a couple of examples. And a few had established trading houses. For example, the Jahanian firm, and this is Arbab Khosrow Shah Jahan, who was one of the brothers who ran the Jahanian firm, and the Jamshidian firm, which was established by Arbab Jamshid. And Arbab is a title denoting land ownership. So they both had owned large amounts of land. And both of these firms also offered money lending services. And the British were very much aware of the influence of a number of key Zoroastrian merchants. And in an 1897 Foreign Office document, Arbab Jamshid was listed as one of 28 prominent merchants in Tehran, and Khosrow Shah Jahan was listed as one of the key merchants in Fars province. And this is a photograph showing Arbab Jamshid in the middle there, surrounded by some members of his staff and their families, I suppose. I don't know if it's his family, who the children are, I'm not sure. But I think that's in Tehran. So very successful merchants. And the British became particularly interested in this. In the 1890s, Lieutenant General T.E. Gordon stated that Iranian Zoroastrians were, I quote, rich and prosperous merchants who have close personal and commercial relations with the prosperous Parsi community in Bombay, and they own a large share of the import and export trade of Yazd. Similarly, after traveling in Iran in 1888 to 89, Lieutenant Henry Vaughan had suggested that a British or native agent should be appointed in Yazd, where a large proportion of Iranian Zoroastrians lived. And he argued that if Iranian Zoroastrians were better protected and felt safer, they'd invest even more of their wealth in trade with India. So although in a global context of British trade, the volume of trade between Iran and India was not a huge amount, it was still significant in terms of Anglo-Russian rivalry. And a Zoroastrian merchant, Ardashir Merban, who was one of the brothers who ran the Merban company, which traded between Iran and India, he was considered for the role. He had been born in Yazd, but lived in India for about 20 years, and he owned land both in India and Iran. Ultimately, he wasn't formally appointed to the role, as it was deemed to be too provocative in view of local Muslim attitudes towards Zoroastrians. But he was seriously considered for the position, which shows the strategic significance that Zoroastrians were believed to hold. And the establishment of vice-consulates and consulates across Iran in the last decades of the 19th century was prompted in part by this Anglo-Russian rivalry. And in 1895, the British established a consulate in Kerman, which was another area where there was a Zoroastrian community. And the first consul, that was Major Percy Sykes, and I think that's his sister Ella Sykes, but I'm not 100% sure. She definitely traveled to Iran. It is, thank you, Sue. She traveled to Iran with him and also wrote about her travels too. And Percy Sykes held this position until about 1905, and he also wrote about Iran, and some of his articles were published by the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. So yet another link with the RAS. And Sykes worked very hard to make the situation in Kerman safer for Zoroastrians and to encourage Zoroastrians to trade with Parsis in India. He was very much trying to push trade links between the two Zoroastrian communities. And he hoped that if Kerman became safer, maybe some Parsis would want to even move back, but move to Iran. But it was described as moving back or returning even though the sort of, maybe they'd been in India for hundreds of years, it was described as returning to the ancient homeland. So you do see that the British hoped that Parsis might be tempted to increase their trade with Iran, particularly via strategic overland trade routes, which would sort of go through Sistan towards Kerman. And that was because the British wanted to strengthen border regions. And in 1900, the British consul in Sistan wrote an open letter to in the Times of India, addressed to Sir Jamsetji Jeejeebhoy, a prominent Parsi, and he urged Sir Jamsetji Jeejeebhoy to encourage Parsis to trade along this route. So he had this letter saying, can you tell the community, would anyone be interested? Wonderful opportunities. And they were in touch about that. And I think that building on that, this idea emerged for an idea for a Parsi colony in the Sistan region. And again, the British did encourage this. And this idea was partly linked to Parsi concerns about their future in India and worries about a decrease in their political and economic influence as India moved towards self-governance. But this Parsi colony idea aligned with British aims, as the British were worried about the weakness of frontier regions and wanted to increase trade in Sistan. So there's an assumption that if Parsis were settling here, there would be some kind of British support for this. And this colony plan was also mentioned during the 1904 British commercial mission to southern Iran, which was partly planned by Percy Sykes. So again, we see Sykes coming up. And in the planning stages, Sykes suggested that, I quote, a Parsi might be attached with advantage in view of the special efforts which I am making to unite the Kerman Parsis, by which he means Zoroastrians, to their Bombay co-religionists. So a couple of Parsis were nominated to join this mission, but in the end, it was decided it might be too dangerous. And I think I read somewhere there was also a problem with insurance. They were worried it would be too expensive as well. So in the end, the Parsis didn't go. But the members of the mission were very keen to meet with Zoroastrians and to get information about the Russians and to see how British trade could be increased. And the discussions were facilitated by Ardeshir Reporter, who was the Amelioration Society emissary at this time. So after Khattaria, there was someone else, and then it was Ardeshir Reporter. And the mission was helped by members of Zoroastrian Anjumans, councils in both Yazd and Kerman, most of whom were merchants. And one of the organizers of the mission, Arthur Gladau Newcomen, stated that the Kerman Anjuman might be called the Chamber of Commerce in Kerman. So they gave very valuable information. The Kerman Anjuman mentioned that Zoroastrians had recently started drinking tea. So that would become a very profitable import commodity. And they also suggested that the British lower the price of their merchandise in order to instigate a trade war with Russia. I feel like perhaps the Zoroastrians would have profited from this as well. So lots of interesting details in the archives. Ardeshir Reporter was pro-British and emphasized to other Zoroastrians, I quote, the mistake of having any dealings with the Russian consul of Kerman, who was called Alexander Miller. But some Zoroastrians did associate with Miller. They accepted an invitation to see samples of cloth patterns and tea as well at his home. So despite British relations with the Parsi community, loyalty from Zoroastrians in Iran was not guaranteed. And the Russians were also keen to strengthen relations with Zoroastrians in Iran. And soon after the British commercial mission, the Russians organized their own sort of rival trade mission to the same area. And Russian reports from the late 19th century noted that Zoroastrians in Yazd and Kerman were keen to do business with them, and also that they were very keen in learning Russian. So we then see that education is another area where this Anglo-Russian rivalry plays out. And again, Sykes appears, and in collaboration with Sir Dinshaw Pettit, who was head of the Amelioration Society based back in Bombay, they had a plan to try and increase English language learning among Iranian Zoroastrians. And one idea was to bring Iranian Zoroastrian boys to India for part of their education. And Sykes argued that the government of India ought to endorse this scheme as it would strengthen Parsi links to Iran and would increase British influence, I quote, without any cost to imperial funds. So what not to like in that? And he believed that it would have a positive impact on trade, arguing, I quote, we shall gradually forge the Parsis of Persia into a political weapon that will, I anticipate, help us to baffle Russian intrigues in southeast Persia. So that was Sykes' idea, but the Russians also tried to support the education of Zoroastrians. And in 1904, they sent 100 books and 2 maps to the Zoroastrian school in Kerman. Meanwhile, Sykes was also pushing English language learning in the same school through the annual award of a gold medal to a Zoroastrian pupil who had made progress in learning English. So in this photograph, you can see some of the boys are wearing the medals. I don't know if they're recipients of the prize from previous years or if maybe there was a gold one and then some extra medals for other things. But that's their sort of, I imagine, end of year prize giving photo. And at the time, the head teacher of the Zoroastrian school was a man called Khosrow Shahrokh, who had spent some time in India for his education. And in 1904, Shahrokh was awarded a medal by Sykes, apparently in recognition of the efforts he made to warn Zoroastrians not to deal with the Russians. However, just months later, Shahrokh left his position as headmaster to take up a role as a Russian agent in Odessa. So apparently this had been the work of Alexander Miller, the Russian consul, who persuaded him to take this post. Ardeshir reporter, the Amelioration Society emissary, who was pro-British, was not impressed and said that Shahrokh was offered this position to stop English from being taught in the school. And according to the consular summary for January 1905, I quote, one of Mr. Miller's objects in Kerman is undoubtedly to create a Russian or rather anti-British party amongst the Parsis, meaning Zoroastrians, of southern and eastern Persia, and through them among their co-religionists in India. So here we see that concerns about the wider implications of these pro-Russian sentiments amongst some Zoroastrians in Iran. So Sykes then requests that the government of India sends a replacement teacher, and he says, this would be by far the best method of influencing the Parsis, again meaning Iranian Zoroastrians, at small cost. He thought the government of India should contribute to the salary, as one could not possibly expend such a sum to better advantage. In the end, Shahrokh only stayed in Odessa a few months. Apparently the position was badly paid. And he wrote to Sykes and said he would give, I quote, full details as to Russian plans of action for defeating British supremacy in commerce. So it's clear the British and the Russians were both keen to win over the Zoroastrian community in Iran, at times using education as a way of strengthening their influence and their trade links. And I think in an article about the prize giving in 1904 in a Parsi journal, Sykes is described as someone who exerted himself to induce the Bombay Parsis to turn their kindly glances to their fatherland and settle there under British protection as traders and merchants. So another aspect of this was, if it was safer in Kerman, maybe Parsis would also move there and just strengthen those links even more. Sykes left his post in 1905, and he was in London in May 1906 and gave a talk about Zoroastrians in Iran. And there were a number of Zoroastrians in the audience, including Sir Manchaji Bhawnagri, who was a Conservative MP from 1895 to 1906. And Sykes praised the work of the Amelioration Society, but said that Zoroastrians needed to donate more towards this society, hinting that it was due to low wages that Shahrokh had left and gone to Odessa. Sykes emphasized the importance of the relations between Zoroastrians in India and Iran. And he said, the destiny of the Zoroastrians is bound to their ancient home of Iran with links of steel, and the Parsi who assists to fulfill that destiny will outshine in luster that of all the merchant princes in Bombay. And after this talk, a number of members of the audience referred to the proposed Parsi colony, including Colonel C.E. Yate, who had worked in Baluchistan, and expressed his disappointment that the plan had not gone ahead. He said he would gladly assign land for the scheme. Lord Curzon was also at the talk. He'd been the Viceroy of India between 1899 and 1905 and had agreed to back the proposal made by Sykes and pet it for some Iranian Zoroastrians to be educated in India. And he also appealed to the Parsis to do more to help Zoroastrians in Iran. Parsis didn't like to be criticized in terms of their charitable reputation. And Bhawnagri stood up and said that they would gladly help their compatriots in their ancient fatherland. And when reports of the talk reached India, there was a fund that was set up. And Ratan Tata gave a huge amount of money at the time, £500, and donated it towards the Amelioration Society, particularly for education. But it seems I couldn't then find any information on what happened with all this money. And I feel like everything was put on hold, likely due to the political situation in Iran at the time, which saw the Iranian constitutional revolution. So the Iranian constitutional revolution came out of demonstrations that were taking place in 1905, 1906, particularly in the capital. And it brought together merchants as well as Muslim clerics, members of the ulama, some of whom emerged as leaders of the movement. And the protesters called for less foreign interference in Iranian affairs, particularly in relation to the economy. There was also anger at the price of basic commodities. The 1905 Russian Revolution and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 had both negatively impacted trade, contributing to higher prices. And a key event in the revolution was the Bast, or taking sanctuary, in the British legation, and that's what this picture shows. So in July 1906, about 14,000 people, predominantly merchants, campaigned camped in the legation grounds. And the Bast was funded by wealthy merchants, including Arbab Jamshid, who we saw earlier, the Zoroastrian merchant who had the trading firm. During the Bast, members of secret groups, semi-secret groups, who'd been influenced by the Russian Revolution, spread ideas about democracy. And it was then that protesters started demanding constitutional rule. And it's likely that Ardeshir reporter from the Amelioration Society was also involved. About a month, Muzaffar al-Din Shah agreed to establish that there should be a national consultative assembly, the Majlis, and he agreed that he would sign a constitution. Sign a constitution, there I am. So what impact did all of this have on Zoroastrians? Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no, that's right. Sorry, I forgot which side comes next. So the merchant Arbab Jamshid was elected as the only non-Muslim in the first Majlis, which convened in October 1906. And in India and in Britain, Parsis welcomed the establishment of the Majlis and the inclusion of Arbab Jamshid and sent messages of support and thanks to the Shah. In November 1906, Nowroz Parvis, a Parsi railway contractor and businessman, gave a talk in London about Indo-British trade with Iran. And the content of this talk was reported not only in India, but also in newly established constitutionalist papers in Iran. Parvis saw the election of Arbab Jamshid as the start of a new era. Optimistic about the situation in Iran, Parvis followed the view that the British ought to capitalize on their good relations with Parsis to increase trade with Iranian Zoroastrians. He argued that the Russians wanted to strengthen their relations with Zoroastrians, even perhaps that they wanted to have a Zoroastrian colony in the north of Iran. Meanwhile, Parvis was an advocate of the Parsi colony plan in Sistan, believing it would regenerate the area to the benefit of the British, the Zoroastrians, and the wider Iranian nation. And some British members of the audience, for example, George Birdwood, who was also a member of the RAS Council, another link, he was also in favour of this Parsi colony idea and tried to encourage Parsis to be more involved in Iran. And Parvis, during his talk, he highlighted that attitudes towards Zoroastrians were changing in Iran, and he saw the revolution as a turning point. Similarly, in India, commentators referred to the awakening of Iran and looked forward to greater Parsi involvement in their ancestral home. But some did ridicule the idea of a Parsi colony, and this is from a Parsi, it's called the Hindi Punch, but it was run by Parsis. And this cartoon shows, it's sort of based on a story from the Shahnameh, and it's the flying throne of Kay-Kavus, and the king has made this raft with eagles tied who are flying up to try and get to bits of meat, but then they get tired and the whole thing tumbles down. And in this cartoon on the king, it's written scheme for Parsi colony. So not all Parsis thought this was a great idea, but it was being discussed in the community. Although Parsis were supportive of the revolution and even considered offering financial support to a planned national bank, their enthusiasm was affected by the murder of a prominent Zoroastrian merchant, Parviz Shah Jahan, who's in Yazd in February 1907. So Parvis was one of the brothers who ran the Jahanian firm, and Zoroastrians in Iran went on strike and pushed for justice. They also drew on their relations with Zoroastrians in India and with the British. So in Shiraz, Parvis's brother implored the British consul, George Graham, to request that the British minister in Tehran, Sir Cecil Spring Rice, use his influence over the government to ensure that the atrocity should not go unpunished. And Zoroastrians in London also put pressure on the British. So Ardeshir reporter, who's the Amelioration Society emissary, he telegraphed Sir Bownegri in London, who alerted the India office, as he thought that in this case, British involvement would more likely see justice done. And Bownegri argued that even if Parvis wasn't a British subject, the British were bound to take an interest as Parvis had been involved in trade between India and Iran. And again, from India, we see the Amelioration Society pushed for action to be taken. And it's the president, Sir Dinshaw Pettit, sent a cable to Spring Rice, who was the British minister in Tehran. Spring Rice then wrote to the Iranian foreign minister, Ala al-Sultaneh, and to one of the clerics who'd been a leading figure in the revolution, Mohammed Tabatabai. And Spring Rice warned that care should be taken not to alienate influential and wealthy Parsis. And in his letter to the cleric, Tabatabai, he referred to a speech that the cleric had made in the Majlis, where he talked about religious equality. And Spring Rice argued that in view of this speech, the cleric should push for the crime to be punished. And the British then reassured the Parsis that the authorities in Iran recognized that Zoroastrians must be protected, particularly as powerful Parsis motivated by race patriotism might direct funds towards the new Majlis. So soldiers were sent to Yazd to restore order, clerics were told to preach in favor of Zoroastrians. There was a trial of sorts, but the suspects took sanctuary at a shrine, so escaped further punishment. And even though it wasn't completely resolved, writing from London, Bownagry did say that the steps taken had helped prevent further violence. So we see at this stage of the revolution, the British are supporting Zoroastrians in Iran, similar to what was going on prior to the revolution. However, according to some scholars, for example, Pierre Oberling and Farhang Mer, British support for Zoroastrians was severely affected by the signing of the Anglo-Russian Convention in August 1907. So this agreement between the two powers detailed their policies towards Iran, Afghanistan, and Tibet, and to some extent ended their rivalry. It was prompted partly by British concerns at the rising power of Germany and the Russians' domestic situation with the recent revolution and the Russo-Japanese War as well. And this agreement divided Iran into three zones: a Russian zone, a British zone, and a neutral zone. And they agreed that they could seek concessions in their respective spheres of influence, and that revenue from customs could be used to repay loans that their banks had made to Iran. The agreement claimed, I quote, to respect the integrity and independence of Persia, but it was drawn out without any Iranian input, and Iranians regarded it as a British betrayal of the constitutionalist cause. We also see that Indian nationalists sympathetic to the constitutionalists in Iran also expressed their anger at the agreement and argued it didn't respect Iran's independence. And some similar criticisms were made by Parsis. And here we see another cartoon from the Hindi Punch of the Persian cat being tugged in both directions by the Russians and the British. So there was some criticism from India too. According to Pierre Oberling, the convention had a negative impact on Zoroastrians, and he argued that before the deal, Zoroastrians who'd backed the revolution had British support. However, the Russians did not support the constitutionalist cause, and after the agreement, not wanting to upset the Russians, the British were less willingly to openly support constitutionalists or to criticize the new anti-constitutionalist Shah, Muhammad Ali, who had succeeded his father in January 1907. Oberling says that because of this, there was a noticeable decline in British support for Zoroastrians in Iran after August 1907. But I would say that close examination of Foreign Office files reveals that the British did continue to support Zoroastrians, perhaps not quite as openly as before. But there are lots of examples. For instance, a merchant called Bahram Gushtasp was murdered in Yazd in November 1907, and Spring Rice made unofficial representations to the Persian government. And the continuity of British support for Zoroastrians can also be seen following the murder of the merchant Arbab Fereydun Khosrow in Tehran in January 1908. So Fereydun also worked for the Jahanian firm, and he supported the constitutionalist cause. He was involved in some organizations that were bringing weapons to Tehran, and his murder was seen as being linked to recent tensions between royalists and constitutionalists. There was a big reaction in Iran with Zoroastrians involved and constitutionalists, and there was calls for justice, and they referred to recently passed supplementary laws to the Constitution, particularly to one article that stated that all Iranians were equal before the law. And that was, it didn't specifically say, that it didn't matter what religion, but that was implicit, that it was meant to mean that it didn't matter if you were Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, you were meant to be equal before the state law. And the British also got involved. So Charles Marling, who was the new British chargé d'affaires in Tehran, contacted the Prime Minister of Iran, Nizam al-Sultaneh, who promised to secure the arrest of the perpetrators. And there were other instances of British intervening in this period. In Shiraz, the council, Thomas Graham, let Rostam Shah Jahan, one of the brothers who ran the Jahanian firm, stay in the consulate for his safety after Rostam had received threatening letters and shots had been fired at his house. And Graham privately contacted local authorities and asked Marling to help too. And the wider British community in Shiraz sent a petition, including missionaries from the Church Missionary Society, and they said they were concerned due to common humanity, as well as the fact that Zoroastrians, some of them were British subjects and were large representatives of our commerce. So we see that commercial ties continue to be important. The Jahanian firm had links with a British firm called Dixon & Co., who also contacted the Foreign Office asking for British support for Zoroastrians. Zoroastrians also cited their economic influence when they asked for support. So one of the Shah Jahan brothers went to Marling and said, "Can you publicize British concerns about Zoroastrians?" Marling then sent a letter to the foreign minister, which was communicated to the Majlis and to the Shah. And he stated that the British took a very warm interest in Zoroastrians and pressed for the punishment of the killers of Feridun. He argued that the imperial government cannot fail to recognize what a serious loss would be entailed upon Persia by the disappearance of such an industrial mercantile community. Several men involved in the murder were punished, but a couple of them escaped quite soon after, or perhaps were let to go free by the Shah. And the hostility of the Shah towards the Majlis intensified. In June 1908, he ordered the Russian-backed Cossack brigade to seize control over Tehran, and the Majlis was bombarded and shut down for just over a year. And this was known as the period of the Lesser Despotism. During this time, the British continued to support Zoroastrians. For example, in Yazd, the vice-consul was reminded that although British policy was strict non-intervention in Iranian politics, he should offer unofficial help to Zoroastrians because of the interest taken in this community. And after a year, constitutional rule was restored. Muhammad Ali was replaced by his young son, Ahmad, who became Shah. And Kay Khosrow Sharok, who had been the headmaster and then the agent in Odessa, reappears, this time as the Majlis deputy. And he held this position until his death in 1940. So the reinstating of constitutional rule was positive for Zoroastrians, but there were still instances of violence against members of the community, and the British continued to offer protection. So I would say that although the Anglo-Russian Convention, I would say it didn't affect British relations with Zoroastrians in Iran, but it did have broader implications for the ability of the Second Majlis to succeed. And the British didn't support the Second Majlis when the Russians advanced on Tehran in December 1911. And this resulted in the dissolution of the Majlis and a break in constitutional rule until 1914. It's also worth noting that there were critics of British policy towards Iran in Britain. And during the period of the Second Majlis, some individuals who supported the constitutional revolution continued to push Parsis to see themselves as Persians who should be more involved in Iran. In London in September 1910, at one of several events organized by the Parsi publisher Nasarvanji Manikji Cooper, who promoted Parsi ties with Iran, both Sir George Birdwood, who we saw earlier, and the Persian minister in London, Mirza Mehdi Khan, spoke on the theme of the responsibility that Parsis held towards their homeland. And Cooper outlined that some Parsis were thinking of once more making Persia their home. Edward Brown was also trying to push these links. He was a strong supporter of the revolution, and he believed Parsis could offer financial assistance. He helped initiate discussions that took place in 1910 regarding a possible Parsi loan to Iran. In India as well, the possibility of Parsis returning to Iran during this period was discussed. Here's a cartoon which was called To Iran, and it shows the ghosts of Yazdegerd III, the last Sasanian king, and Nasr al-Din Shah, and they're discussing between themselves, saying that Parsis might come back to Iran and work hand in hand with Iranians to rebuild the country to its former glory. So this was a topic that was discussed, but by 1911, in view of British legation advice from Tehran about the lack of safety in trade routes, many Parsis were swayed against the idea. But Edward Brown did continue to support the constitutionalist cause and encouraged Parsis to contribute to the success of Iran. And at another of Cooper's events, he spoke on the duty of the Zoroastrian community towards regenerate Persia. He said Parsis should cooperate for the good of the fatherland, and he gave a vigorous and earnest appeal to the Parsis to look upon Persia as their real home. He said Iranians viewed Parsis as belonging to themselves, not as foreigners. And Cooper spoke along similar lines, the idea that Parsis could help Iran retain her independence. So at this stage, discussions appear to be more about Parsi links with the whole of Iran, rather than Parsi links just with the Iranian Zoroastrian community. And in India, Zoroastrians were critical of British policy. They appealed to the Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, and to the Prime Minister, particularly in 1911 when the Russians were advancing. And they asked the British government to support Iranian attempts to safeguard her liberty and integrity. And here's another cartoon from the Hindi Punch showing the Persian cat being approached by a boa constrictor, which is Russia, depicting Russia. So the Parsis did try, Zoroastrians in India did try to use their historically good relations with the British to protect the gains of the revolution, but without success. So the second Majlis was dissolved in December 1911. And even after this date, Zoroastrians in Iran continued to get protection from the British during times of insecurity. For example, in June 1912, Bownegri alerted the Foreign Office about the dangers faced by Zoroastrians in Yazd, and the British agreed to safeguard the community, whose welfare His Majesty's government takes a special interest. But a few years later, the strength of British relations with Zoroastrians in Iran was tested, with demands being made by British and Russian banks operating in Iran for the repayment of loans, contributing to the bankruptcy of the two major Zoroastrian companies, the Jahanian and the Jamshidian firms. And this led to a lot of anger amongst Zoroastrians, and tensions also rose as Zoroastrians still owed money to the British, but didn't necessarily repay the loans. And the consul in Kerman was dissatisfied at the pace of repayments. And so he refused to satisfy the Zoroastrian Anjuman's request that he confirm in writing that the British would protect the community. And we also see during the First World War, Iran declared neutrality, but this wasn't respected by warring parties. So there was fighting going on in Iran. And because of British actions in the past, there was quite a lot of pro-German feeling amongst constitutionalists. And in 1915, the British consul in Kerman tried to remove a local official who was pro-German. And Zoroastrians apparently wrote to Tehran saying, no, keep the official in place. And the British consul was very frustrated, and he wrote in his diaries, am I to continue to protect a community which worked actively to upset my plans? So you can see that there was definitely tension at this stage. And after the war ended, anger at Britain increased in Iran due to the terms of the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919. Ultimately, this deal was cancelled, but had it gone ahead, it would have given the British a lot of influence in financial and military affairs in return for a loan. And amongst those who opposed the agreement was Qajar Sharok, the Zoroastrian politician. And then soon after, in 1921, we see the rise of Reza Khan, who launched a successful coup, became prime minister, and then by 1926 had secured his place as Shah, founding the new Pahlavi dynasty. And this, under Reza Shah, there was a form of nationalism promoted that looked back to the pre-Islamic past. And this built on a trend that was already gaining ground before. For example, in this journal, Qajar, you see articles about ancient Iran, and it was named after one of the characters from the Shahnameh. So during this time, there were stronger links between Iranian Zoroastrians and the state, and weaker links with the British. And in contrast to the period of Anglo-Russian rivalry in Iran, Parsis were mainly being encouraged to invest in Iran by the Iranian state rather than by the British. Some Parsis were keen to go to Iran, particularly for business opportunities. A doctor went called Manik Dadi. He stayed for a time with Shahrokh, who was described by Major B. Temple, who was working in Tehran, as being anti-British, and he'd connected this to being pro-Persian. So you see these broader links between Zoroastrians in Iran and the whole of Iran. In 1922, the Iran League was established by Zoroastrians in India. Similar to the Amelioration Society, it did help Iranian Zoroastrians, but it also had broader goals, trying to improve relations between the whole of Iran and India, reflecting a shift in the position of Zoroastrians in Iran and Parsi relations with the country. So overall, we see this shift from the mid-19th century to the 1920s in relations between Iranian Zoroastrians, Parsis, and the British. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, the British supported the work of the Amelioration Society, encouraged Parsis to trade in Iran, even to consider settling there. There was pressure for the British to help because of their relations with the Parsis, but they were also keen to strengthen these ties between Zoroastrians in India and Iran to increase their own influence and to counter Russian influence. And we also saw that with education as well as trade. And it's been suggested, as I said, that British support for Zoroastrians swiftly declined following the Anglo-Russian Convention. But I would say it did continue, perhaps not as openly as before. And by now, trade links with Zoroastrians were established, and the British were interested in the welfare of Zoroastrians, partly because of these direct trade links, for example, Dixon and Co. British supporters of the constitutional revolution encouraged Parsis to view Iran as their homeland, and they sort of tried to promote Parsi relations with Iran more broadly. And then after the dissolution of the Second Majlis, relations between the British and Iranian Zoroastrians seem to have weakened, particularly after the collapse of the two major Zoroastrian firms. And then this trend continued with the rise of Iranian nationalism, which looked back to the pre-Islamic past and was increasingly critical of the British. So I hope that gives a bit of an overview of some of my research about the relations and this complex shifting and overlapping and all the intrigue. And it's based on my book. If anyone is interested, there are also leaflets there. I have to plug my book. There is a discount code, and it's also coming out in paperback next year as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was fascinating. As someone who works a bit with the Great Game further in sort of Central Asia, West and East, it's fascinating to see what's going on in the sort of Western part of that arena, you know, and it's so complicated, isn't it?
Very complicated,
very fascinating.
Layers,
yeah,
lots of different layers of intrigue.
And I think you did a fantastic job sort of making it intelligible.
Thank you.
Yes, providing a narrative. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So questions, anyone? Okay. No, wait, I need to give you the thing.
Alexandra, thank you very much for such an interesting talk. Would you say that the reason that the idea of founding a Parsi colony in Sistan province failed partly because the Parsis were doing and are doing so well in India. So the incentive really was not there to leave India. And also the British Raj in India was courting the Parsi community so much and encouraging it to expand ever more and take up new projects in India to support the British rule itself there. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think on largely I would. I think it would have been a big effort to have set up a colony in Sistan. It would have, like you say, required people who were quite comfortable to relocate. The person who proposed it, I think the idea was that maybe Parsis who weren't doing so well might be interested in relocating. And there were some concerns that with increased, perhaps more self-governance in India, maybe if there's more sort of representative government, you know, the Parsis being such a small community wouldn't have as much representation. So they were thinking ahead that in the future their influence might decline. So that was sort of one reason why it was discussed, that this was a sort of open, fresh fields open to Parsi enterprise. But yes, I think there were multiple reasons. Like you say, on the whole, Parsis were doing well in India and had very good relations with the British. It did carry on. So Reza Shah as well, there were a few times when he said, oh, you know, why aren't you coming back? And there was some sort of, yes, press campaigns, and it did keep coming back up, this idea of either a Parsi colony or Parsis going back to Iran to start businesses. No. A few people did go back, and in the 1920s you do find quite a few records of Parsis traveling to various parts of Iran, looking at opportunities for mills or for water irrigation projects. There were some Parsi businessmen who were going around opium, that just with different ideas of what they might be able to do. There was a mill that was established, which was partly funded by Parsis, partly by the Iranian government, but it didn't last very long. But yeah.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah. Alexandra, this is the 4th talk that I'm attending. And every time that I come for one of these talks, I'm learning something new. And especially this time, the fact that you told about the Russians sponsoring the books and things in Kerman was quite fascinating. I never knew about that. So I'm looking forward to more talks to attend. I have been, just going back to your question, during my research, I did come across a lot of Parsis who moved to Iran in the 1960s and 70s, especially in this, what was it? The Shiraz University, what was it called? I can't remember right now. But a lot of them, they went to different universities as professors and to do the businesses in the 70s and 60s. And then during the revolution, they did come back. So even in late 70s, it was happening that a lot of Parsis from Bombay were traveling to Iran. But going back to the questions that I had, I have been very fascinating with the role of Ardeshir reporter and Shahpur reporter. I don't know if at all during your archival research, you came across any role that Shahpur played during the 1953,
I'm afraid I didn't go that far.
Okay.
I didn't go that far. It would be interesting to look into that.
Anything more that you have some light to shed on the role of the reporter, the two reporters, something more that you came across?
Know much about, to be honest, but Ardeshir, I mean, he was involved in so many different things. Not only was he the Amelioration Society emissary, he was also, I think, the correspondent for the Times. He was in Tehran, he was involved in these semi-secret societies, he was teaching for a bit. Incredibly, I don't know how he managed to do all of these different things.
And did he have a natural death, or was he murdered, or was it Shah Rukh who was? Because Shah Rukh was murdered.
Likely to have been murdered. Again, it's a bit unclear, but it probably.
And then one last question: I was speaking to the president of the Zoroastrian Trust Fund of Europe, Malcolm, and he told me once that there was also a proposal from the British to make a colony for the Parsis in Bahrain. Have you ever come across this? But yeah,
Dude,
my
that's
sister may know
fascinating.
about this thing, but he told me about Bahrain, and I'm like,
What period? Do you know? I'd be fascinated
he told
to
me
hear
that he came across it at some point, and he doesn't have any memory of it or any documents that he came across. So that's something that I'm quite inquisitive about.
I'd be very interested.
Yeah, so probably we'll look for it together sometime. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for really lovely and rich and complex talk. It was absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to ask you to make it even more complex. Of course, the Parsis were not the only community, the Zoroastrians moving back between Iran and Mumbai, Bombay. There was, I mean, certainly in Bombay, there was a large Irani community, Mughal community. And I was curious as to whether their experience of this period in the Great Game, to some extent, either reflected that of the Zoroastrian Parsis, or whether it was inflected in different ways, and whether the difference in religion placed them differently vis-a-vis both the Iranian government and the Qajar state and the British Empire.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer it though. I didn't look so much at the other communities just because of the amount of research I needed to do. But as far as I could see, the British were particularly interested in pushing these links with the Zoroastrians because of their relations with the Parsis. So the Zoroastrians were seen as particularly sort of like advantageous as a community to have good relations with. But like you said, there was a lot of trade, not necessarily Zoroastrians trading between India and Iran. But I'm afraid I can't answer your question. It would be very interesting to learn more about that, though.
Okay, I'm just going to, if Matt is there on the other end of this thing, if there are any online questions.
Hi, we had one, but I think it's sort of been covered in that last question. It was, is it fair to assume that Parsis' geographical location in Iran and their proximity to the British gave them leverage as compared to other ethnic communities in British India, and a possible reason for the enormous wealth and land accumulation across pan-British India?
Thank you. So yes, and when the British were developing Bombay, now Mumbai, the Parsis were offered land as an incentive to move to the area. So they were given land for a dakhma, a burial sort of funerary site where the vultures come and eat the bodies. So they were offered reasons to move to the area. So quite early on, there was a relatively large Parsi community, so they were quite early to get land. So that is a sort of history behind that. But yes, I mean, they did establish these close relations with the British. And then, like you say, the position of Zoroastrians in Iran meant that it was yes, useful for the British to have good relations with the Zoroastrian community because of their geographical location in Iran.
Thank you. And then we just had people saying, thank you for the interesting talk.
Thank you very much for watching, everyone online. Thank you.
Well, with that, I'm going to close this session, but join us for drinks and you can ask our speaker, who now seems to sit down after a long time. You can ask her more questions before we take her off for dinner. So thank you all very much for coming and for you online. And thank you again, Alexandra, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.